The Russian Empire, once a colossal force of power and control, now lies in the grip of a slow, suffocating death. A death forged in the fires of war, bloodshed, and unrelenting brutality. For years, the empire tore across lands, suppressing the cries of the nations it crushed underfoot. The once proud Tsarist regime, in its insatiable greed for power, left a wake of devastation across the vast Russian plains. In the shadow of war, desperation took root. Secret whispers began to stir through the starving masses, long crushed beneath the iron fist of the Tsars. The rebellion was not merely a political act. It was the vengeful cry of a broken nation. The revolution, a storm of blood, rose from the ashes of suffering and oppression, carrying with it the twisted promise of retribution. But as the flames of rebellion spread, so too did the terror. Fear gripped the hearts of all as the empire's iron grip faltered, replaced by the uncertainty of anarchy. And in the cold, barren winter, the land itself seemed to mourn, bearing the scars of violence that would last for generations. The Russian Revolution was no mere clash of armies. It was an awakening of the horrors that had been festering for decades, a grotesque descent into vengeance and madness, where the consequences of tyranny would be paid in rivers of blood. The fall of the Russian Empire. A. The Romanov dynasty. The Romanov family, which ruled Russia for over 3 centuries, symbolized the absolute power and control that defined the Russian Empire. Their reign, which began with Tsar Michael I in 1613, spanned through some of the most tumultuous periods in European history. However, by the early 20th century, the Romanovs were increasingly out of touch with the realities facing their people. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, ascended to the throne in 1894. Unlike his predecessors, Nicholas lacked the strength and vision to adapt to the rapidly changing world. Nicholas's failure to address the concerns of his subjects sparked growing dissatisfaction. The Tsar's obstinate belief in his divine right to rule clashed violently with the aspirations of a country teetering on the edge of revolution. As unrest spread, the Romanov dynasty, once the epitome of Russian strength, was seen as a symbol of outdated power, disconnected from the needs of its people. B. Social and economic inequality. The gap between Russia's aristocracy and its peasantry was vast, stretching the entire length of the empire. The aristocracy, living in opulence, held power over a starving, oppressed populace. Around 80% of Russia's population was made up of peasants, living in squalor and suffering under the weight of feudal-like conditions. The Industrial Revolution, which had transformed much of Europe, barely touched Russia, leaving its working class to toil in deplorable conditions. Industrial workers faced long hours, dangerous work environments, and abysmally low wages. In cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, factories hummed with the noise of grinding machinery, but the workers toiling within them were no better than slaves. This systemic inequality led to widespread dissatisfaction. The rich grew richer, while the poor were left to languish. The disparity between the aristocracy and peasantry, combined with the poor treatment of industrial workers, fueled the anger and resentment that would later ignite into revolution. Military failures. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, exposed the weaknesses of the Russian military and the incompetence of its leadership. Russia's humiliating defeat in the war shattered the myth of its invincibility and revealed the country's underlying instability. The loss ignited widespread discontent and was a precursor to the 1905 revolution, which, although it failed to bring about immediate change, showed that the Russian people were willing to rise against their rulers. Then came World War I, a conflict that proved disastrous for Russia. Tsar Nicholas II's decision to personally lead the army in 1915 only worsened matters. Russia's military was ill-equipped, poorly led, and unprepared for the scale of the war. The Russian populace suffered tremendously. Millions of soldiers perished, while civilians faced extreme hardships due to shortages of food, medicine, and other necessities. The war deepened the economic crisis, leading to widespread famine, protests, and strikes. As the Tsar remained entrenched in his palace, the suffering of his people grew unbearable. The military failures in both the Russo-Japanese War and World War I exposed the fragility of the Tsarist regime. The war, combined with internal political strife, pushed Russia to the brink. With food shortages, mass casualties, and a restless populace, the Russian Empire finally unraveled in 1917. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, marking the end of the Romanov dynasty and the collapse of one of the longest reigning monarchies in European history. The Russian Revolution would sweep away the remnants of the old order, leading to the rise of the Bolsheviks and the establishment of a new, brutal regime under Lenin. The once mighty Russian Empire had fallen, buried under the weight of its own internal contradictions and failures. Key events leading to the revolution. A. The 1905 Revolution. In the early 20th century, Russia was a boiling pot of discontent. The harsh conditions of the peasantry, the poverty of industrial workers, and the absence of political freedoms led to widespread frustration. This anger boiled over on Bloody Sunday, January 22, 1905, when a peaceful procession of workers led by Father Gapon marched to the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar's soldiers opened fire on the crowd, killing and wounding hundreds. This brutal massacre sparked a wave of protests and strikes across the empire, which soon turned into a full-scale revolution. In response to the unrest, Nicholas II made a concession and agreed to create the Duma, Russia's first parliament, in 1905. However, this move failed to ease the tensions. The Tsar retained ultimate control and dissolved the Duma when it didn't act in his favor. The reforms that followed were weak and largely ineffective, and the dissatisfaction only grew. The 1905 revolution didn't topple the monarchy, but it showed the Russian people that their ruler was incapable of addressing their needs and desires. B. World War I and the Russian Army. The outbreak of World War I. In 1914 pushed Russian society to its breaking point. Initially, there was some patriotic fervor, but the war soon proved to be disastrous for Russia. The Russian army was poorly equipped, ill-fed, and led by incompetent commanders. As casualties mounted and food and supplies dwindled, the suffering of soldiers and civilians deepened. The war took a severe toll on Russia's already fragile economy, leading to widespread poverty and discontent. C. February Revolution, 1917. By 1917, Russia was on the edge of collapse. The war had drained the country's resources, and the people were exhausted. In February 1917, widespread strikes and protests broke out in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. Petersburg, driven by food shortages and the harsh winter. Workers, soldiers, and ordinary citizens took to the streets, demanding change. The army, which had long been loyal to the Tsar, began to mutiny. The once unshakable support for the monarchy began to crumble as soldiers sided with the protesters. The Tsar, Nicholas II, found himself powerless to stop the uprising. His attempts to regain control failed, and the protests grew larger and more violent. Faced with a complete collapse of order, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate on March 15, 1917. This marked the end of the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years. The abdication of the Tsar was the final nail in the coffin for the Russian Empire, which had been weakening for decades. The Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1923. After the fall of the Romanov dynasty, Russia plunged into chaos, and the struggle for control of the nation intensified. With the Bolshevik Revolution and the overthrow of the provisional government, the stage was set for the Russian Civil War, a brutal conflict that would shape the fate of the nation for years to come. A. The Red Army versus the White Army. The Bolsheviks, now in power under Lenin, formed the Red Army to defend their revolution and secure their vision of a socialist state. Led by military strategist Leon Trotsky, the Red Army was composed of workers, soldiers, and peasants, united under the banner of Bolshevik ideology. They fought not only for survival, but for the creation of a new world order. However, they faced fierce opposition from the White Army, a coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces. These forces were diverse, made up of monarchists, liberals, and other factions opposed to the radical changes that the Bolsheviks sought to impose. The White Army received support from foreign powers such as Britain, France, and Japan, who were determined to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. These countries feared the spread of communism and sought to restore Russia's monarchy or install a more moderate government. The foreign intervention added another layer of complexity to the war, turning it into not just a civil conflict, but a proxy battle between competing global powers. As the war raged on, Russia became a battlefield for both internal and external forces, with no side willing to concede defeat. B. The role of Leon Trotsky. At the heart of the Red Army's success was Leon Trotsky, the fierce and calculating leader who would prove pivotal in securing Bolshevik victory. Trotsky was not only an exceptional military leader, but also a charismatic figure who could rally the troops and inspire them to fight for the revolution. Under his command, the Red Army was transformed into an effective fighting force, using innovative tactics and exploiting the weaknesses of the White Army. Trotsky's ability to motivate and discipline his soldiers made him a crucial figure in the fight for Bolshevik survival. The brutality of the Civil War, widespread violence ravaged the country, and civilians were caught in the crossfire. The Red Terror, unleashed by the Bolshevik government, further exacerbated the suffering. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, arrested, tortured, and executed perceived enemies of the revolution. Anyone suspected of opposing the Bolsheviks, from aristocrats to ordinary workers, faced violent reprisals. Famine added to the misery. The war disrupted food production, and millions of Russians starved. The brutality was not limited to the battlefield. It seeped into every aspect of life. Executions became commonplace, and the streets were often filled with the sounds of gunfire and cries of agony. The Russian people, already worn down by years of war and revolution, now faced the true cost of the Bolshevik victory. The legacy of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Civil War ended in 1923 with the triumph of the Bolsheviks. The Soviet Union was formally established in 1922, consolidating Bolshevik power across the former Russian Empire. The dream of a communist utopia had been realized, but the price of that victory was steep. The country had been ravaged by years of war, repression, and famine, and the foundations of a new society were built on the bones of the old one. The fall of the Romanov dynasty marked the end of Russia's imperial past. The Tsarist autocracy had crumbled, and the Russian Empire was no more. The Bolsheviks had succeeded in dismantling the old regime and replacing it with a new order. Yet in the ashes of the empire, a new tyranny had taken root, one that would be defined by the iron grip of the Communist Party and the enduring legacy of Stalin's rule.